Hey guys, it's Mr. B here, and today we are going to learn about commas with introductory elements or phrases. Now, I have this video that we're going to watch, and it's a little boring. Not really, but kind of. So I'm going to pause it throughout, and I'm going to explain some things. They use a little bit of, they use some big words that might not make sense to you, and that's okay if it doesn't, because like I said, I'm going to pause throughout and I am going to explain a little bit in some easier language, easier to understand language, what exactly they're talking about. Okay, so we're going to start, and then, like I said, I'll pause throughout.
Hello, grammarians. Paige and I are here to teach you about introductory elements in sentences and how commas relate to them. Paige, how should we define what an introductory element is?
So it's pretty much something that happens at the beginning of a sentence. It can be like a dependent clause or an adverb, but as we will see soon, it is something that is separated off with, of course, a comma.
Because that's what commas...
Okay, so important distinction there. When they said introductory element or introductory phrase, okay, they said a big word there called a dependent clause, or they called it, sometimes it could be an adverb, right? And they're going to talk in just a second about what exactly a dependent clause is compared to what an independent clause is. But there's two phrases there, a dependent and independent clause, that I want you to pay close attention to, because that's important on how you know where to put the comma in the sentence.
They are separators.
And that's what commas are. He just called commas separators.
So let's talk about dependent clauses first. Let me just write out a sentence that begins with a dependent clause. When you come in, please take off your shoes. And I've made the difference between the dependent clause and the independent clause pretty clear. So this is, the dependent clause is purple, the independent clause is green.
Okay, so he just said the dependent clause is purple and the independent clause is green. Now I want you to stop for a second and think about what would be the difference between these two sentences, or these two parts of the sentence, I should say. What's the difference between the purple part and the green part? Okay, one difference is, well, one comes at the beginning, the other comes at the end. But just read the parts by themselves. So for instance, the purple part, when you come in. Okay, now read the green part. Please take off your shoes. If you noticed something there, what you probably noticed was that please take off your shoes could be a sentence by itself. Therefore, it's called an independent clause. It can stand alone. It can be by itself if it wanted to. The purple part, when you come in, is not a sentence by itself, right? If I were to just say a sentence to you, when you come in, that doesn't make much sense, does it? Okay? It needs something else. So it's a dependent clause. It depends on something else to help it become a sentence. And that's where the other part of the sentence comes in. So when you start a sentence with a dependent clause like this, something that needs another part of the sentence, after it, you need to write a comma. And they're going to talk a little bit more about that right now.
Is there a need for a comma here?
Of course.
Okay, because we're leading with a dependent clause, and that means that this thing can't stand on its own, right? It's like the ladder up against the tree. Because an independent clause in green can stand on its own, a dependent clause cannot. So we need to differentiate it.
And I love that analogy, right? He talked about a ladder standing up against a tree. And I love how he colored it too, because he matches the colors with the colors of the sentence. Think about a ladder standing up against a tree. Okay, a tree itself can stand by itself, right? You look at outside, and you see trees; they can stand by themselves, right? They're independent, just like this part of the sentence. Please take off your shoes. But when you come in, this part is like the ladder. Okay, you can't just stand up a ladder by itself. You need to lean it up against something. It needs help, right? In order for it to stand up. So the ladder, or the first part of the sentence, is a dependent clause. It depends on something else to stand up on its own.
From the rest of the sentence by putting the comma there. So this is a dependent clause. This is an independent clause. So if you start a sentence with a dependent clause, you're going to need to put the comma in the middle before you proceed to the independent clause, which is the part that makes it an actual functioning sentence.
Right.
If you have it the other way around, though, if it's just please take off your shoes when you come in, no need for a comma. I'll show you. So I'm not sure why this is. I think it may just sort of be a style relic. I'm not entirely certain. I mean, if you go back in American history and you look at like the Federalist Papers and you look at the way that people used commas in the 18th century, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense relative to how we use commas today. So a lot of this is cultural. But I can tell you that when an independent clause comes before a dependent clause, you don't use a comma. And
he's just saying when the part of the sentence that is independent, right, that can stand on its own, comes first, like he just showed you, you can flip-flop these sentences or these clauses and they would still make sense, right? When you come in, please take off your shoes. Or please take off your shoes when you come in. When the independent part comes first, you don't need a comma. But when the dependent part comes first, you need that pause, you need that separator. Okay, you need that comma. And he was saying he doesn't really know why. Just back in the day, it's just part of our culture, how our language was formed, and so there's no real reason for it. But that is just the rule that we have to use grammar.
If you are uniting two independent clauses, in the following sentence, I rode an elephant and then I ate a mango. These two things are both independent clauses, right? I rode an elephant, then I ate a mango, right? Like these two things need to be connected by this conjunction and, but that's not all. They also need to be joined by a comma. Now you could also sub out if you wanted to, get rid of this comma and this and put in a semicolon, but that's a story for another time. So if you're uniting two independent clauses, just do comma and then a conjunction. So that's one way to think about how to use commas for introductory elements like dependent and independent clauses. But there's also another thing I want to introduce you to, and that's sentence adverbs. Follow us over to the next screen. So Paige, what is a sentence adverb? How does it work?
So we've been talking about, starting sentences with clauses, but that doesn't always have to be the case. You can start a sentence with an adverb. Like, let's say, initially, I was afraid.
So what is initially doing in this sentence here, in this expression?
Basically, it's modifying, like, the whole rest of the sentence. It's modifying the I was.
Okay. So what he's saying is an adverb. What it's doing is it's modifying or changing the meaning of the rest of the sentence, right? If you were just to cover up this initially part and just say, I was afraid. Well, that's one way of saying it, right? But if then you add that adverb, which is describing how you were afraid or when, it is saying initially I was afraid. So at first. So that kind of modifies or changes the sentence.
I was afraid.
So we're going to put a comma here to separate it from the rest of that expression. That's why we call it a sentence adverb. Because this is not the same as saying I was initially afraid. This is kind of, like you said, modifying the entire expression. Let's look at another example.
Basically, you're the greatest.
Oh, thanks, Paige. So we've got this word basically, and basically is modifying the entire expression. It's kind of qualifying the whole thing.
Right.
So we're going to put a comma between this sentence adverb and the sentence itself.
Exactly.
Cool. So initially, Paige, this seemed pretty complicated to me.
Right, but basically, I think we got it down.
All right. We think that essentially you can learn anything. David out.
All right, guys. So what I need you to do now is I put a sentence in Google Classroom as a question, okay? So you have an exit slip today. And it's a sentence where you're going to need to identify the dependent clause and the independent clause, and I need you to put the comma in the right place, okay? So you'll see a sentence there that's it's going to not make much sense because there's not going to be a comma there. What I'm going to do is underneath the sentence, you're going to see a place to write the dependent clause and the independent clause. So you're going to write both parts of the sentence. You're going to see a sentence, You're going to break up the sentence into two parts, the dependent clause and the independent clause. And then you're going to retype the sentence with the comma in the correct place. That's what your goal is today. Okay? All right, friends. I want you to go ahead and get started on that. Open it up in Google Classroom, and we will see you later.